Thank you for joining us for Advancing Women's Entrepreneurship, Why Gender Parity is Key to Economic Growth. My name is Susan Duffy. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership at Babson College, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. For the next hour, we will recognize and celebrate the impact of women's entrepreneurship worldwide by taking a deep dive into the findings from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, better known as GEM, 2012 Women's Report. This study not only broadens our understanding of the extraordinary economic contribution of women entrepreneurs worldwide, it also serves as an input to policy decision-making, a foundation for entrepreneurship education programs, and a guide to future research. I'll begin with a thanks to our partners. First, our GEM partners, Universidad del Desarrollo, University Tun Abdul Razak, and Babson College. I'd also like to thank the team at the Center for Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership at Babson and our colleagues at the International Council for Small Business Women's Entrepreneurship Committee. At any time during the hour, if you'd like to send us a question, please type it into your computer and hit the chat tab at the bottom of the screen. Toward the end of the session, I'm going to be curating your questions and will pose those to our panelists. It is now my absolute honor to introduce a panel of internationally recognized women entrepreneurial leaders. I'll begin with our moderator, Babson College President, Dr. Kerry Healy. Dr. Healy is an internationally known and respected leader with nearly 3 decades of experience in academia, government, and diplomatic and humanitarian work. She has led numerous diplomatic and philanthropic initiatives in the United States and around the world, and much of her work has had a special focus on the welfare and advancement of women and children. I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Healy as the first woman president in Babson's 95-year history. Welcome, Kerry.
Thank you.
Dr. Donna Kelly is a GEM 2012 Women's Report author. She is an associate professor of entrepreneurship at Babson College, where she holds the Frederick C. Hamilton Chair of Free Enterprise. Dr. Kelly teaches a variety of courses in the Entrepreneurship Division and conducts research on innovation in startups and established corporations in the United States and Korea, and on entrepreneurship education in China. Welcome, Donna.
Thank you.
Dr. Candida Brush is a GEM 2012 Women's Report author. She is the Franklin W. Olin Distinguished Professor in Entrepreneurship and the Chair of the Entrepreneurship Division at Babson College. Dr. Brush is a founding member of the Diana Project and known worldwide for her pioneering research in women's entrepreneurship. Dr. Brush conducted the first and largest study of women entrepreneurs in the early 1980s, resulting in one of the earliest books on the topic. Welcome, Candy.
Thank you, Susan.
Dr. Patricia Green is a GEM 2012 Women's Report author. Dr. Green holds the Paul T. Babson Chair in Entrepreneurial Studies at the college. Her research focuses on identification, acquisition, and combination of entrepreneurial resources, particularly by women and minority entrepreneurs. She, too, is a founding member of the Diana Project and currently serves as the National Academic Director for the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Businesses Initiative and an advisor to the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Women's Program. Welcome, Patty. Welcome all. Thank you again, Dr. Healy, for moderating our discussion.
Thank you very much, Susan. And you can imagine how excited I am to be here with all of these incredible experts on women's entrepreneurship. As a first woman president of Babson, it makes me so excited to be able to come in and have colleagues like these. So we're going to have a discussion today about the different types of entrepreneurship that women engage in around the world, what makes entrepreneurship more attractive or less attractive to women around the world. And we're very excited to have these experts who have spent many years, over 25 years in many cases, delving deeply into these issues. I'd just like to start by asking you, Donna, tell us a little bit about GEM, because not everyone watching this is going to have some background around the GEM report.
Yes, GEM was started in...
And first of all, say what it is. It's the Global Entrepreneurship Monitoring Project.
Okay. Global Entrepreneurship Monitor Research Project. It was co-founded by Babson College and London Business School, Bill Bygrave at Babson College and Michael Hay at London Business School. And really the objective of GEM initially was to measure entrepreneurship around the world, to identify who is starting and running businesses at various phases of the process, their motivations for starting, their ambitions for growing their businesses, and to also tap societal attitudes, because societal attitudes are important in identifying potential entrepreneurs, the societal support for entrepreneurship, as well as the stakeholders, the people financing, buying from entrepreneurs, and so forth. The research project started with its first survey in 1999 with 10 developed economies. We're up to 70 economies now, surveying almost 200,000 people around the world on entrepreneurship. And it has become the largest comprehensive global survey of entrepreneurship in the world.
And so tell me, Patty, you and Candy have been doing this kind of research for years and years. You're considered the top researchers on women's entrepreneurship. When you were asked to write this report, what did you hope to accomplish by creating this report?
I think Candy and I are starting to have soapboxes, antiquated term, but just these things that we really think are important to get out there. And one's the idea of a virtuous circle, that you do the research, you learn from it, it informs what you take into the classroom, and it informs how you work with practitioners, how you guide policymakers, and really goes back to them, well, then what are the new research questions? So it just builds this wonderful circle of how we actually increase our knowledge about women business owners and their businesses. The other part that I think enthuses us a great deal about this project is that we're not just talking to the women business owners. We're talking to other people in the population. We're talking to experts in the field in different countries. So we really get a more full sense of how the society feels about entrepreneurship, what resources are there, what opportunities are there. So much better overall sense of how this all works.
Mm-hmm. So Candy, how did you approach this report? What sort of a story did you set out to tell?
Well, as Patty said, we've been in touch with policymakers and educators around the world, and so we really started by thinking, what are the questions? What do people really want to know? And so we thought about these questions, and then we went right to the data, and we were able to connect 3 important questions directly to the data. So the first question is, who are the women entrepreneurs? What rates do we have in different countries? What are their attitudes? What are their motivations? The second question is, why do they start businesses? Are they motivated by necessity? Are they motivated by opportunity? What are the things that sort of catalyze that move into entrepreneurship? And then the third question that people want to know is, how do they create value? Social and economic value. Is it jobs? Is it innovation? Is it growth? So those are the 3 questions that we set out to answer in the report.
So Donna, how many women entrepreneurs are there out there?
Well, based on our survey, 67 economies were included in the report. We estimate that 126 million women are starting and running new businesses. And this, to put it in perspective, is about the size of Japan, which is the 10th largest economy in the world. But further, we estimated that 98 million women are running more mature businesses that have survived beyond the startup stage.
Mm-hmm. Now, how much do these rates vary around the world?
Quite a bit. In sub-Saharan Africa, on average, across the 10 economies we assess there, about 27% of women are starting and running new businesses, and that's as high as 40% in Zambia. But it does dip as low as 4% in some of the Middle East, North African economies.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think accounts for these regional differences? Why do we have more women participating as entrepreneurs in some regions and fewer in others?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, Carrie. So it really sort of comes down to 2 things. Now, just to go back to the sort of what GEM does is we survey individuals. So we're capturing their individual motivations and attitudes. And those are 2 things that really make a difference. So societal attitudes about whether entrepreneurship is a positive kind of activity or a good career. And so we look at the attitudes towards opportunities. Do people see opportunities for entrepreneurship? Now, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, 69% of the people see positive opportunities for entrepreneurship. And in Latin America, the same is true with about 50% of the population. And so we know that opportunities or perception of opportunities for entrepreneurship is correlated with the likelihood of starting. Mm-hmm. Now, the second thing has to do with your motivations, and that is opportunity and necessity motivations. We always talk about opportunity motivation, and in the developed economies, that's really more of a prevalent motivation for why people start businesses. So motivation is opportunity motivation is correlated with level of development. But at the same time, necessity motivation is important as well. And so even in sub-Saharan Africa, 37% are motivated by necessity, and that means that they had no other opportunities for creating an income for themselves, so they started a business because of that. And the same is true in the United States. 21% of women were motivated by necessity in the U.S. Now, of course, the economic recession notwithstanding, we did see higher necessity motivations in the U.S. during the recession as well.
But Candy, is necessity a bad thing? Isn't it the mother of all invention? Is that?
Yeah, again, that's a good question, because necessity is not just that you are sort of in dire straits. I mean, necessity can be catalyzed by the fact that you are between jobs, or that you have a different family circumstance, or that you can have been laid off, or downsizing, right-sizing. So there's lots of things that can sort of form that necessity. And so it does give, if you are motivated by necessity, we do find that sometimes necessity-motivated entrepreneurs tend to persevere a little bit more. And again, necessity or opportunity motivation is certainly not correlated with the outcome over time in terms of the outcome of the business.
Now, Patty, I'm assuming that not all women entrepreneurs are the same, and that they have different profiles and different impacts on their society. Can you comment a little bit on that?
It's so important to remember that not all women are alike. I mean, just look around the table. We've got different interests, different backgrounds. If we were starting businesses, and most of us have, they'd be different kinds of businesses. So you can't just lump all women together and say this is women's entrepreneurship. It's the impact question that I think many people are interested in, because right now impact really means job creation. You know, how are these women impacting the economy? And if I take a step back for just a minute and think about the economy of the United States, a lot of people don't realize we've got about 28 million businesses owned by men and women in the United States. Only 6 million of them are employers. It means 22 million do not employ anybody but themselves. But if they didn't do that, you'd need 22 million more jobs. So that's a huge impact when you create your own job. If you step out of the United States then, Latin America has a fairly high prevalence of women involved in entrepreneurial behaviors, and about half of them create jobs, at least one job. If you go over to developed Asia and developing Europe, there you've got a lower level of women in entrepreneurship overall, but about 3/4 of them are creating jobs. And of the women in entrepreneurship there, about 1/4 want to create 6 or more jobs. So you're talking impact. It's just funny to wrap this up that when we talk gazelles, we usually mean high tech, super fast growth, that kind of business. But if you look at economies around the world, if you create 6 jobs, that's a gazelle. I think we should start calling them lionesses for women entrepreneurs. I just thought of that this morning. I think we should have a new name for that.
So Patty, with all of that background, where should society be focusing its efforts? Should society be trying to create more women entrepreneurs, just in an absolute sense, or should they be focusing in on fewer, more high potential ones, the lionesses? Yes.
Yeah. I kind of like the lionesses. I think I'm going to keep going too. But it's not the either or. You know, it's back to creating your own job is impact. Creating many jobs is a different kind of impact. So that's the really important part, is to think about what they're doing, how they're doing it, how we support that overall. No one right thing. We need the whole portfolio of types of businesses.
Okay. So Donna, shifting slightly, so what do we see for gender differences in entrepreneurship? What can we learn from the societies that have more women engaging in entrepreneurship?
Right. Historically, there have been more men than women engaged in entrepreneurship, but we're finding that not only is women entrepreneurship increasing around the world, but we're also recognizing the different approaches that create value for the societies. We have 2 economies in GEM that actually have more women than men entrepreneurs, in Thailand and Panama. And our Thailand GEM team reported that it's really culturally embedded, that business is very supported for women, and it's rooted in long traditions and of heroines historically that are seen as very tough, but also combining femininity, respect, really those two aspects, the sort of the strength as well as respect and honor.
So-
But we also have, I'm sorry,
No,
we also
please.
have
It's fascinating.
5 other economies,
Yeah.
mostly south of the U.S., Mexico and Ecuador, that have equal levels of women and men participating, as well as 3 sub-Saharan African economies, Nigeria, Ghana, and Uganda. But it's also important to note that in 3 of the regions of the world, we have in the U.S., and the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe, where women entrepreneurs actually have a higher level of education, and they're equally as likely to run businesses that are seen as innovative.
Very interesting. Well, and it's also interesting to me too, because both Thailand and Panama send a great deal of students here to Babson. So maybe there's a correlation with that. So Patty, I'd love to get your perspective on what you think might account for some of these gender differences between countries.
That's where you go back to context again. I mean, there's such differences in economic systems, political systems, religious systems, right down the line. And sometimes we even forget to think how many women are even in the workforce. So the comparisons have to be done really, really carefully as far as what does the country look like, what does the country believe in, those types of values, and then think about what does this mean for a woman choosing to be entrepreneurial, to start a business possibly, and to grow it. It means very different things. What kind of access are there to markets? We started off talking about the parity, and really Candy and I talk about this a lot. We're really interested in equality of opportunity, that if women have an idea and want to pursue this, that the resources are in place for her to do that.
Candy, can I bring you into this discussion? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, so it kind of goes back to what Donna just mentioned about, historically there have been more men entrepreneurs in the world, around the world. But now we're starting to see more women entrepreneurs. And so the paradigm that we had for how you start a business and what you're supposed to do, even who you're supposed to be, this sort of risk taker, hero figure that comes up with this brilliant idea and gets lots of venture capital, that whole model is something that's been perpetuated. But the reality is there's many more ways to start a business. And so women have different pathways into entrepreneurship. And so I think what we're starting to see here is different pathways into entrepreneurship. And I think this report starts to hint at that in terms of the attitudes, the motivations, and the processes that they use.
Well, that notion of pathways leads into, I think, a discussion around entrepreneurial ecosystems. At Babson, we often talk about the importance of having the right ecosystem for entrepreneurship. What, in your opinion, both you and Patty, what are some of the factors in the environment that influence the rate and nature of entrepreneurship, particularly for women? And what are some of the practices or programs that you're seeing that can influence these issues?
Well, it's funny because Candy and I both speak on ecosystems, and I use a rainforest example, where it's, you've got the big trees, but you've got all the vines. Candy uses the ocean.
I use the ocean.
So, we have these different visuals on how, but all getting to the same point that you need many different kinds of things to support that. Also go back to just saying it's an environment where people do even think about entrepreneurship, where women think that it's possible, and the resources to start and the resources to grow are there. One program that Babson works with is Goldman Sachs 10,000 Women program. And I think that program really shows clearly how it's done in a different environment with all those different things we talked about, but there's some fundamental elements about entrepreneurship that support very, very different pathways in, and taking consideration of all those things is how you build your own ecosystem.
Yeah, and then we have to think about schools and universities around the world. There's probably 3,000 colleges and universities around the world that offer entrepreneurship classes. But not too many schools have classes that are for women entrepreneurs, and some might say, well, we don't need to have a separate class for women entrepreneurs. But there seems to be some evidence that may be needed, because if we start to look at the numbers of women in venture accelerators, for example, it's still probably less than 10 to 15%, even in the Boston area and around the world. There are some good examples. If we think about the Women's Organization Accelerator in the UK, that was a venture accelerator that was designed physically for women entrepreneurs. And it's one of the first in the world that was really designed to meet the needs and help women to pursue that pathway.
Can you expand on that a little bit? What was different about this accelerator, if you know? Yeah.
Well, it was fun because I was on one of the advisory committees for that, and we actually went around and looked at other incubators, and we learned there's some really interesting research out of Ireland that looked at everything from where the lights went on and what time the lights went on, and all the different structures and systems and how they were built, because they were used to having all guys in the building. So they looked at lighting, they looked at common space, they looked at
Color.
Well, we actually wanted water flowing through, but we didn't get that one. But it was really to build a space that
wouldn't be hard in
supported, yeah, to support collaboration. I think that was one
Yeah.
of the big things. And I actually just for the first time got to go see it about 3 weeks ago, and it's working beautifully.
Oh, that's
Just
great.
absolutely
And if I
beautifully.
could bring
And
Susan
Susan,
in.
yeah.
I was going to ask to bring Susan in on this one. You just started an incubator, accelerator for women. Tell us about that.
We did indeed. We started the Women Innovating Now, WIN Lab, which is an accelerator that helps women move from the entrepreneurial ideation process through to early prototype. And what we're doing is we're capturing these differences that you've all just been mentioning. We differentiate on 3 key ways from the typical accelerator: people, process, and place. So people is extraordinarily important. As entrepreneurship educators, we know that building self-efficacy means that one of the key ways we do it, we have to learn vicariously through others. When we see that the model of a successful entrepreneur is usually kind of the young, white, male hero figure, that doesn't resonate with women. So on the people front, we've built a community of women entrepreneur experts, women speakers, women coaches and mentors to create a different optic so that when women look, our students look at those leaders, they can say, well, she can do it, I can do it. And that's really, really important. We also have created a different process. We've moved away from the hyper-competitive Shark Tank environment of this is how you must start a business to a much more collaborative process. Now, we still push boundaries, we push for experimentation, but we really aspire entrepreneurial potential by, helping women see that it can be done and they can be supported by other women. And finally, place. We take women out to women-owned businesses so they can see that it's a different environment. We help them, we have a partnership with something called the Collaboratory 4.0 in Boston, which is a women's business co-working space. And it's different. And it invites the women to just see that there are different ways. Our motto is not that one is right and one is wrong. It's that there's more than one way to get here, and we're building that alternative.
That's great. Before we move to questions from the web, I'd just like to give Donna a chance to kind of draw all this together and comment on that ecosystem question.
Yeah, highlighted throughout the report, we got input from the GEM members about what is happening in their economies in a local area in terms of promoting women entrepreneurship. And let me just cite a couple of examples. In South Africa and Poland, they cite new laws that require women to hold a certain percentage of the government high positions. And in Uganda, there are new initiatives to enroll more girls in tertiary education or college education. And so those are general factors. We could think of sort of the indirect ecosystem elements that might boost up women's education levels and their empowerment that could lead to starting businesses. But more specific to entrepreneurship, when we talk about Taiwan and the Korean government, they have training programs and startup contests, and we see this in a lot of the other economies around the world. In the U.S., this happens both through government initiatives, through our SBA, our Small Business Association, but also private companies like Walmart and Office Depot. And in Chile, there is funding for women entrepreneurs through a government agency. It's called Cercotec, and a public-private initiative called M Capital. And we see funding as well in other countries. Ireland has an interesting initiative called Going for Growth, and it was started by Paula Fitzsimons, who's the leader of the GEM Ireland team. They identify mentors, women entrepreneurs that have successfully grown their businesses, to host roundtable sessions with women and to inspire them to actually grow their businesses. So it's a focus not just on starting, but growing your businesses. And another interesting element of that initiative is they use peer networking or peer mentoring where they set milestones and they get together a month later and talk about how they did relative to those milestones. And we have many other initiatives that talk about the visibility of women and fostering their networks to try to encourage these efforts.
Wonderful. Well, Susan, I think we're going to see if we have some questions from the web.
We do indeed. Our first question is from Monica Smiley. What are the most important steps to encourage women entrepreneurs to hire that first employee?
Everybody's looking at me. Well, and hi, Monica. It's good to hear from you. Thank you for your question.
Where's Monica from?
It doesn't say.
Okay.
So, to hire the first employee, I think that's a really interesting mindset. And the part of it is looking at what you can do, what you like to do, but what you want to build, and recognizing that if you are going to build, you're your own limitation. You can only do as much as you can personally do. I would say the biggest thing to do is be careful not to hire yourself. We always look at, it's a comfort level. I want to work with someone like me. I want to have trust in those skills. But in reality, look for someone who's complementary to your skills. But at the same time, look for someone that you look forward to spending time with. Take the time to actually learn how to interview, to really, we like a performance-based interview. What have you done that I can help understand what you will do, that kind of thing. And there's some good resources out there, both through the SBDC, and talk to Susan Duffy's organization as well, too. That'll help.
Let me just throw in one thing. It's also an economic decision as well. So you have to decide if you want that person full-time, part-time, or on a contract. And so that depends upon what your growth goals are, but you have to be willing to be able to support that with the resources that you have.
Okay, and I do want to follow up that Monica Smiley is from Enterprising Woman
Enterprising
magazine.
Women, yes.
And
She's the
reach-
publisher.
Yeah, they
Yes.
reach 1 million women entrepreneurs in 185 countries with both print and digital.
And hold a
great.
wonderful annual conference as well. So check them out.
Yeah, there we go. And we have Monique, and Monique is from Colombia. Is there any difference between women entrepreneurs that are singles and have no kids, between those and those who are managing families?
Well, we don't cover that in our data necessarily, but I would say that the difference is that perhaps you have less constraints on your time. So if you have a family, and you all have a family, whether you're a single person or whether you're in a relationship, you do need that support. So you need a support system and that support system has to positively be engaged in the conversation of what you're doing when you start your business. So you may have a little bit more time in terms of less constraints on your time, but you still need that support system.
Yeah, and let me add that sometimes entrepreneurship can add an element of flexibility to people that have families. But we also see in some of the economies, and this was covered in the report a little bit in some of the boxes throughout the report, is the importance of childcare, and that might be embedded in society where in China, for example, the in-laws or parents might care for the children. But in other societies, like in Europe, there are daycare, availability of daycare is really important in that.
We also look at family businesses a lot here at Babson. I'm wondering if women can become entrepreneurial in that way.
Absolutely.
Yes.
In fact, there is some literature that looks at women succeeding into the leadership role in family businesses. And I think historically, most of the work focused on the male successor. But increasingly, even here at Babson, we're seeing lots of our students that come in who are the first female successor to be the CEO or in charge of that family business. So that's a little bit of an under-researched area, but it's a phenomenon that we're seeing with increased frequency.
Now, the U.S. GEM report that we just it came out about 2 months ago, we did in the chapter on women entrepreneurs, we also looked at part-time employing family members, and we found that women were more likely to employ family members both part-time and full-time. So it's interesting, the family
Yeah,
business
I was just
is
wondering
important.
if a family might actually be a support to a woman who wants to become entrepreneurial as opposed to a hindrance in some cases. So
Yeah.
Yes and no. I mean, in fact, if you look at U.S. data, it's a different data set. We have something called the Panel Study of Entrepreneurial Dynamics, where we looked at startup of businesses in the U.S. and we looked at nascent entrepreneurs. A little bit, it was the predecessor to the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. And the reality was that most businesses were started by a collective of family members. They either worked in the business, they were co-founders, they invested. So you could almost argue that businesses often start as family businesses, but may not stay as family businesses by that definition.
And that's why we track societal attitudes in GEM and why we really place a lot of importance, because not only does it tell us what the bank of potential entrepreneurs are in the society, but also the support they'll have. And that's
Yes.
also through families as
Yes.
well.
So, from Pat Seitz, we get, do you have any insight as to women entrepreneurs starting out as part-time ventures versus full-time ventures?
Most businesses start out as part-time ventures. I mean, really, while you're working on the idea, while you're thinking about what is the real opportunity and checking the feasibility of that and building that out. So in reality, most of them do start part-time until you have possibly the plan, probably not, but at least some resources in place that you can actually step up and go into it full-time. So, I mean, it's really, that's the nature. It's like starting with the family. They usually start with family. They usually start at home. They usually start part-time. They start small. That's just the nature of the evolution process.
But then at some point, you have to decide whether you want that business to be more of a business rather than a part-time endeavor. And so and growth is a choice. You don't have to grow. You can manage your business more to your own needs and your own sense of control. But you do have to make a decision at some point or whether you want to continue it as a part-time endeavor. Because if you're working somewhere else or volunteering, or your time is a little bit fragmented. So you may have to make a decision at some point that you want to continue to put your full-time efforts into that.
And that's a commitment question. If you're asking other people to join you, it's often a question, if they see the commitment that you're leaving for part-time, you're stepping into this full-time, that's a huge signal to resource providers of all kinds.
Absolutely.
You know, it's interesting, and we found this in the U.S. report, that even in the U.S., a developed economy, we have a lot of one-person businesses. We have, I think it was about 2/3 were operating at home. And so sometimes a one-person business might be somebody operating on part of a value network where they work with other people that are also running parts of a chain of activities that come together that provide an opportunity.
That's a neat way to put it.
Yeah.
So I'd like to switch gears a little bit, and we have a question from Linda Woods Curtin from Boston, and she's asking, can you talk to us a little bit about the access to capital issues and what we're learning about angel and venture funding? I'll throw that one to you, Candy.
Oh yeah, that's something that I've been doing a lot of work on. In fact, very recently, I've been doing some work that looks at applications to a local angel group that meets here on the Babson campus. We have about 1,200 applications. And so we've looked at all different variations of what happens to these businesses through the screening process. Do they get desk rejected? Do they get to the screening committee? Do they get to the big presentation? And do they actually get funding? And so one of the things we've looked at is whether or not teams, entrepreneurial teams that have only men on them, that have a mixture of men and women on the executive team, or predominantly women on the team, are more successful in getting through the process. And we find that if you look at just the men and women-owned teams, don't look at the hybrids, we find that that there's no differences, that women are just as likely, a team comprised of women entrepreneurs and men entrepreneurs is just as likely to make it through the process in terms of getting to that big presentation and actually getting funding. But then when we dug a little bit deeper, what we found was that the women-owned businesses were much better prepared. They were much more ready for funding. They had a more fully formed management team. They had more capital invested and so forth. And so there's some interesting questions that fall out of that, is that if you have better prepared women-owned businesses, does that mean that the male-owned businesses are slightly less risky when they get to that investment question, or not? But it does, it's an interesting finding to know that there's no differences in getting through that process.
Yeah, and so a follow-up that comes from Marcia from the United States is slightly different take on the funding question, and I'm reading about people starting businesses using personal credit cards. What's your take on this approach?
Depends on the credit cards.
Yeah.
It used to be there were times
Depends on
where it
how
was
much.
the cheapest money you could get.
Yeah.
You know, so I think it's looking at the fact of the matter is, like starting small, starting that, you're going to start with your own money.
Right.
You know, until you get to some point where you can convince others to join you, they want to see that you believe in it enough to put your own money. However, credit cards can be risky. You need to deeply understand all the terms of your credit card and manage it very, very carefully as far as when it's time to roll it over, those types of things. The biggest thing about the funding is understanding all the sources.
Right.
Candy and I had done some work with the rest of the Diana Project years ago in bootstrapping, getting creative about sources of funding and getting creative about not needing so much funding and really building out from there.
Yeah, exactly. And so instead of actually hiring an employee, you might have a student team. We have students here at Babson that will do projects for entrepreneurial startups, and they're called management consulting field experiences. And so that allows an entrepreneurial business to have a student team do a project. And so there's no cost to the business. The students get a grade, and it's a great way for a business to accelerate their growth through some sort of temporary project. But it is the choice to use only credit cards. I mean, the reality is you need multiple sources, and a credit card is a debt. And so a lot of times you don't want to be opening the doors of your business and having a high debt load because you've been using credit cards that have high interest rates. So you have to be very careful about how you use those early sources of capital.
Okay, great. Donna, back to you. In terms of the opportunity versus necessity, do we know what the differences are between men and women in those categories?
We actually find that they're very similar in many of the economies. In some sub-Saharan Africa, there tends to be more necessity-driven women because they are providing income for their families. You know, again, creating an opportunity to lift themselves out of poverty, provide for their families. In the United States, it's equal numbers of necessity versus opportunity entrepreneurs.
And so here's an interesting question from Giselle Aguilar. And I think she might be an entrepreneur because the question is, I'd like to know what the most profitable field business is in women's entrepreneurship at the moment. What would your recommendations be for establishing a startup or for a startup that's looking to expand? Do we have any thoughts on
Two
that?
different questions
Very
here,
different.
right?
They actually are, but what's hot, I think,
So
is
what's
at the
hot?
core of that.
Okay. Well, Patty, what are you seeing in the Coleman program?
I question the question a little bit.
I might not be paraphrasing it correctly.
No, but I think one of the things we always see people ask about, what are the characteristics that lead to success? You know, and while we are not characteristic people by any stretch of the imagination, passion for what you're doing. So I think it's hard to look around and go, that looks really good. I think I'll do that because somebody else's numbers look good. So, I mean, there's certainly a lot of interesting things happening in life sciences. There's a lot of interesting things happening in robotics. There's a lot of interesting things happening in
Alternative energy.
nanotech,
exactly,
yeah,
exactly.
cybersecurity.
All of which, by the way, are extremely expensive types of businesses to get into.
Right.
So I you're going to be spending all your time and energy on this. You know,
Right.
be passionate about it. Now, you may be passionate about the process. One of my favorite entrepreneurs was in Kansas City, and his latest business was plumbing fixtures. He was not passionate about plumbing fixtures. He was passionate about the entrepreneurial process. So in that sense, I think it's fair to ask what's hot. But it also depends where you are. You
The
know.
other thing that I just want to mention, sorry, Candy, is that at Babson, we one of our key principles and key philosophies around entrepreneurship is entrepreneurial thought and action, where you start with who you are, which is a lot of what are you passionate about, what you know, so maybe your background, your industry background, but also who you know. And so based on your experience and your interests, you might have a particular network of people that you're able to bring along. So you think about it, if I really love cat sitting or nanotechnology. I'm very passionate about it. I know people in that area, and I know I have some background knowledge. I'm probably more apt to be successful than if I went into another industry that was just barely looking at external circumstances like market characteristics and so forth.
Look, Candy, I know your division often talks about how you find opportunity or how you see opportunity.
Yeah,
Can you? I think that's really what this question is about.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like,
Yeah.
are there opportunities out there
Yeah.
that other people are seeing? But I think that the thrust of what we do here at Babson is much more about, as Donna was saying,
Yeah.
seeing your own opportunities.
Yeah. Well, so let me start by saying you don't have to invent the idea. You can buy a business and be an entrepreneur. You can commercialize technology. You can buy a franchise. So there's many ways to get into being an entrepreneur without inventing the technology or the idea. So that being said, there's different processes that you can use, and Donna touched on one of them, which is the self-understanding. So one of the approaches we use, and there's just one, which is, what do I know? What is my area of expertise? And so if you start from your expertise, it's probably something you care about. And in that expertise realm, you can do a targeted search around what we might call channels of information. That's one. Another way to think about it is to do what we call design thinking. And that would be where you go into the environment, you go into a particular opportunity space. I always like to talk about the airport. Because if you go into the airport and you just sit there and you watch, you're going to identify a whole lot of problems, right? I mean, from the time that people come flying in, they don't know where they're going, they check and stand in line, their baggage check, their baggage is overweight, they put their clothes on to save weight, It's just a whole series of things. There's lots of problems there, and so there's problems that could be solved, and any one of those problems is a potential opportunity. So those are two different methodologies, and there's others that we teach as well that you could use to identify a particular opportunity. And again, she's from Columbia?
No, this was actually Carrie's
Oh,
question.
no, but I was thinking
the
of
original
entrepreneur.
Yeah, the
about
original
that.
question came from there.
Yeah, so
yeah.
in that particular context, there may be other opportunity settings. I'm thinking if you are down by the ocean, there may be something in the fishing, marine science area that you could look at, whereas you might be in Cartagena. There might be something with tourism, and in Manizales there might be something maybe in education or technology.
And if she is near Manizales, she should get in touch with the Manizales MAS program, which Babson is very involved with, and they are very supportive of entrepreneurship of all kinds.
I wanted to add another emphasis we have at Babson is the emphasis on building the individual. Not so much building the business, but building the capability of people to start a business at some point in their life. So you might do multiple efforts at starting a business. You may say, I'm going to get into employment. I'm going to work for somebody else for a while. But to think of entrepreneurship as an option that can be enacted at any point, and that you have the ability, when you recognize an opportunity, when the time is right, to start a business. So I would encourage anybody that wants to be an entrepreneur, and we definitely do this at Babson, to get out and try something.
Yes,
And that entrepreneurship might be multiple efforts where you really learn and you take that learning to your next venture.
Yeah, and I think the entrepreneurial thought and action process is particularly relevant to women. This offers an opportunity to say, I want to do it. I don't have to have it 110% figured out. I can do it with the means I have at hand, with what I can afford to lose. I can take one step and go forward. And, women are risk rational. We want to do things that we're going to be successful at. And by breaking it into one step at a time, let one step lead to the next step, it's a fabulous process to say, I can go, I can start, and then I learn, build, grow from
That's
there.
right.
And I've seen Donna's point embodied by our graduates around the world, and it also interacts with the cultural issues that we were talking about.
Yeah.
So, for example, when I've been visiting our Babson alumni in Thailand, where apparently entrepreneurship is quite accepted,
Yeah.
virtually all of our graduates went back and started businesses immediately. Whereas if they were going back into a place like London, for example, many of them might take 5, almost 10 years before
Right.
sort of finding that opportunity, feeling that they were comfortable taking that leap, and they'd been working for other companies, gaining expertise, and then we're talking about, I'm ready to do it. After
Right.
maybe 7 years. So it's not necessarily something that happens immediately. It's something you prepare for.
And you really bring out a point that I like to also stress is think of the world as your operating ground. That we see in GEM differences in terms of how entrepreneurs engage with other parts of the world. And surprisingly, we think of the U.S. as being very global. but our entrepreneurs are not very
No, they're
global.
not.
Maybe because the entrepreneur really sees the U.S. as diverse enough and has
big
enough
enough market.
opportunities. And, there's also there are cultural differences, there are language differences we see in Europe. The borders are very permeable, and also some parts of Asia. And so that's one thing that I've found with being involved in GEM. We have over 400 researchers around the world in 70 different economies, and we really make a point to learn about other economies. But also at Babson, we send students to China, Russia, and India on a semester abroad. The extent that you can understand new cultures, you really expand your opportunity space.
Very much so.
So I'm going to get back to our questions. We have John Moreno from Colombia, and he says, when we analyze the entrepreneurial pipeline for Colombia between men and women, men present higher indicators in all stages, except in the social perception about entrepreneurship. Why do women have a good perception about creating enterprises, but then it's difficult for her to start a new business? And what are the policy implications that are relevant in this situation?
In GEM, there are two transitions that we really look at that are important. We measure intentions to start, and then we look at, do those intentions, are they translating? We're also having people that are starting and running businesses. And in the U.S., we found about a 1-to-1 ratio. For every woman that is intending to start, there is one that's actually in the process of starting. Whereas in the Middle East, there are about 6 women with intentions for every 1 woman that's starting. The other transition that's really important, too, is are these startup efforts, are they moving beyond the entrepreneurship phase into the established business phase? And we find that actually in the developed economies, we have more established businesses, so we have the problem of we need people to start, because if we don't have enough startups, we're not going to have a pool that will eventually become mature. Whereas in the developing economies, there are concerns with transitioning to mature businesses. Can they sustain these efforts over time? And that could be a factor of maybe the perception of the entrepreneur, but there are also ecosystem elements in economic factors, infrastructure factors, the ability to get labor, the market, the internal markets. It can be hard in some societies to keep those efforts going over time.
I would add that in Colombia, I was there earlier this month looking at the Manizales Mas entrepreneurial ecosystem project that Babson has there. One of the most effective pieces of that project was mentoring. And I wonder if Colombian women who had started businesses, if they had access to peer mentors from their communities, whether that might make a big difference about their willingness to proceed and to develop their businesses.
Yeah. Candy, would you like to build on that?
I was, if I understood the question correctly, I was wondering if so they have entrepreneurial, they perceive opportunities, but they're less likely to start. That was what the question was. So I'm wondering what the family context is, because, and this might have to do with social acceptability and the roles expected for women. And I don't know, I don't have that data, but I'm just thinking that might possibly have an impact. Whereas if the expectation is that women are the primary caretaker of the family, that may limit their possibilities. This goes back to sort of time that you might be able to spend on an entrepreneurial activity. So it's possible that that's another contributing factor.
Now, this question could really go to anyone sitting at the table because it's about entrepreneurship education. And the question comes from Monique, and she's asking, do you suggest that you get experience by going and working for someone else, or by starting your own venture and kind of learning on the job?
There was some early research that showed that working for someone else first did predict greater likelihood of success, whatever you're going to define success as in entrepreneurship. And part of the idea was not just what you learned, it was, well, you saved some money, so you had some financial resources, but you built your network, so you met other people who were in the field who could help connect you to other people. So there is something to be said for acquiring resources, you say learning on somebody else's nickel for a bit. But it's like fit again, too. That works well for some people. For others, it doesn't. You know, they may have already been having a business in high school, you know, or while they were growing up. They may have grown up in a family business, so they already have a lot of these things in place. So it's not one or the other. It's really
No.
about fit. What works best for you according to what kind of business you want to start, according to what kind of environment you're in.
You know, the other interesting thing is we have an entrepreneurial employee report coming out based on GEM, and that should be available on the GEM website in a few days. Really the emphasis that you can work for somebody and be entrepreneurial. And what we found in GEM is some of the societies we have said for a long time have had low rates of entrepreneurship, like Sweden and Denmark, actually have high rates of employees that are entrepreneurs. So in those societies, there may be more incentives or more benefits to being in a company, but there are entrepreneurs in those companies that want to enact their energy. And there are other economies where, especially in the emergent economies, where there is a lot of startup activity, but there are fewer job alternatives. So the startup entrepreneurs account for a lot of the entrepreneurial activity. But then again, in the United States, we have both. And we can think of the sense of people might flow in and out of being entrepreneurial in a company to doing a startup, or we have both types of entrepreneurs.
So there's really three different kinds of experience, back to what Patty said. You need to have industry experience or context experience. You need to have some kind of entrepreneurial activity experience, which is the entrepreneurial knowledge, and you need some sort of education, business education. And so, as Patty said, it depends on where you are in your career and how you accumulate those. So if you have no context or industry experience and you want to start a business in an industry that you do not know, go work for somebody else, learn the industry, and build your network.
That's also saying you can get a job. You know, so there is back to that necessity and opportunity part too. There
Yep.
may not be a job available
Yep.
that you want to do, therefore you may look to be entrepreneurial at that point in time too. That's the environment piece.
Yep.
And the other thing I want to add to it in terms of Babson's approach to education, and a lot of universities are really realizing, is the practice-based approach to entrepreneurship education, where you get in and actually try something. And as professors, we encourage the students to get out, go into an airport, and what are you observing? And that develops your opportunity recognition skills. It also develops your confidence in going out and exploring your universe and interacting with people as well, and that really helps build the skills you need as an entrepreneur.
Yeah. And a Babson student wouldn't have to ask this question because they would have started their own business
Absolutely.
as a first-year student here at
Absolutely.
Babson.
Yeah. At least
run
one.
it, at least one, and then closed it down. So
Right.
they will have already had that first business under their belt.
Yeah.
Great. So our next question comes from Diana Heckavaria, and she's
Oh, I
asking
see.
about, you know Diana?
Yeah,
Um,
Florida.
Right, exactly. I've been doing research with colleagues using GEM 2009 data to identify differences between men and women in value creation goals globally. And by value creation goals, she's talking about the goals of the business regarding value, economic, social, and environmental. And she says that they're finding that women have place a significantly higher value on social roles and men on economic, but there's no difference in environmental. And what aspects of the entrepreneurial ecosystem do you think might be influencing these outcomes?
So I know a little bit about that. I actually did a paper or a book chapter on that a couple of years ago, but I'm not familiar with the most recent data. And so if I recall, we were looking at the mission or the purpose of the business and whether it was social purpose versus economic purpose. And my recollection is that men were more often had an economic purpose. This comes out of the GEM data, whereas women had a mixed purpose, so it was social and economic together.
Yeah.
And that does fit with what we know from previous research on women entrepreneurs. As to why we're seeing this, I guess, I mean, this is, and maybe Patty has a perspective on this, but I would speculate, because I don't know for sure, that part of this might have to do with the fact that mission-driven and social entrepreneurial businesses are much more publicly accepted. This goes back to the attitudes in society. And so I think the possibilities for starting businesses that are socially driven is much, there's more of a support system, there's more acceptance of it today than there was, say, 5 or 8 years ago. The environment is We've got more concerns around energy. We've got more concerns around healthcare. We've got more concerns around education and poverty. And with the smaller global world, we know about the trouble in Afghanistan. I know Carrie's done a lot of work in Afghanistan. And so we know about those problems. And so raising and elevating those social issues to the forefront, partly through the media, which is an ecosystem participant, and partly through the social acceptance, I think that has influenced the possibilities and to make it a little bit easier for women to say, yes, this is my purpose for my business.
I think there's a couple of things that we can tie back there too. One is the role models one.
Yeah, that's
and
a
I'm
good
going to
point.
connect it to Candy and I and the rest of the Diana Project are actually working on a chapter right now on women entrepreneurs and philanthropy for the Kauffman Foundation. And it's the same kind of thing is when especially young women don't always see business as a desirable environment in which to work. But if they're solving a social problem, then all of a sudden it's very, very desirable. So it is a matter of how do we get these role models out there to show that you can do both. There's a lot that can be accomplished there. And for the role model piece, in the philanthropy, we're also seeing that women tend to not put their names on things. They may be donating, but they're not putting their names on things, which is, that's fine, but then young women don't know that that's happening. So there's something there about the role model, about the visibility, and really about the view of what business looks like, which I turn it back to the challenge. I mean, I think that's part of the innovation we want to see happen. Let's change the way business works, how we work together within a business, how businesses work across businesses, and that can make the environment more inviting as well.
I think Carrie should talk about Afghanistan for just 1 second, because that's a social venture.
Well, yes, I think, I actually agree with what you're saying, that women feel more comfortable venturing into things that are very difficult and new, and if they feel that it's mission driven. And certainly that was the case with me, and the work that I was working with the State Department to do in Afghanistan, trying to educate Afghan lawyers and judges around rule of law. But I certainly would not have, for example, decided to establish a business in Kabul, right? But I felt very comfortable that I was going to be able to establish an office for my nonprofit in Kabul because it was mission driven, and I was just going to figure out how to do it. Yeah.
I also have to mention, I think what this really gets at is the importance of having a variety of motivations for starting. And we do track in GEM, are you starting because you want to increase your income, or you want independence in your work? And getting back to something we mentioned earlier, that women have different approaches to business. And if we want to think about women, as I would say in China, holding up half the sky, that we really want to have a variety of motivations, and those will allow different groups in society to enter entrepreneurship and in turn to benefit their societies.
Critical point for policy, because I think most policymakers, based on how they've been educated, assume that all entrepreneurship is primarily economically motivated. And that's not how and why the majority of it's usually in the top 3 to 5 motivations, but it's not usually the top 1.
Right.
And if you change your mindset about why people do this, then you're going to change your policies on how to help them do this as well.
So we have time for one more question, and we'll make it quick. It's from Katerina Maloney, and it actually gets to this point of customizing new products, services, ways of thinking about how women's needs might be somewhat different than the traditional paradigm. And she asks, regarding access to capital in emerging countries, there have been an increased push by international development organizations for banks to introduce tailored products and services for women entrepreneurs, usually for the small and medium business level. What are your views and experiences on this? We only have about 1 or 2 minutes to answer that question, then we have to wrap it up.
We did see some of this in some work we were doing in Bangladesh, where the micro programs were trying to get more sophisticated. I think it's a question of why it's being done and how well it's being done. So I think it's hard to come up with a blanket statement about yes, there should be policies, or no, there shouldn't be policies. It has to fit in again with the political, the economic, the social structure of the country.
Well, there you go. That's it in a nutshell, right? Well, we covered an awful lot of ground today. I want to thank President Healy and Professors Green, Brush, and Kelly, and all of our participants from around the world for this most enlightening conversation this morning. You've helped us all broaden our understanding of the powerful potential of women's entrepreneurship worldwide. You can access the GEM report on the gemconsortium.org website or at babson.edu, and today's webinar will also be available on babson.edu. Thank you. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you.